It always starts the same way, a handshake in the dark, a whispered promise, a code older than the men who swore to uphold it. But in the underworld, loyalty doesn't last forever. Tonight we're stepping inside the moments where the mafia broke its own rules, where brothers turned into targets and where a single betrayal rewrote the future of organized crime. These aren't just stories of rats and hitmen. They're the turning points that changed everything. It began with a man deep inside the machinery of the underworld, Joseph Valacchi. By 1962, Valacchi was serving a long federal sentence for narcotics trafficking, a soldier in the Genovese crime family, one of New York's major mafia clans. While in prison, Valacchi believed his life was in danger. He thought that his boss, Vito Genovese, also incarcerated at the time, had ordered a hit on him. In fear for his life, Valacchi struck first. He killed another inmate he mistook for the assassin. Suddenly facing yet another life sentence under a kiss of death, he made a fateful decision. He would talk. In October 1963, Valacchi walked into a hearing before the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, headed by John L. McClellan. He became the first made member of the American Mafia to publicly acknowledge its existence. For the first time, the mob, its name insiders called Cosa Nostra, was no longer whispered about behind closed doors. Valacchi's testimony peeled back the curtain. He described the structure of organized crime, soldiers acting under capos, regimes organized into crime families, all ruled by a governing body, the Commission. He named the major New York families and identified their bosses, linking generations of crime under concrete names. He described initiation rituals, the secret induction ceremonies, the code of silence known as omerta, the crimes, the murders, the betrayals. When cameras and microphones caught his words, America realized what it had largely denied. Organized crime was real, systemic, entrenched. His dozed-down, calm, matter-of-fact recounting of the mafia's inner workings stunned senators, law enforcement, and the public. Valacchi didn't just break his oath, he cracked open the myth. The hearings didn't immediately send all the bosses to prison. Many of the revelations described decades-old crimes, often beyond the statute of limitations. But he delivered something worse than evidence, he delivered clarity. For the first time, the mafia wasn't a vague threat. It was a mapped network of people, businesses, loyalties, betrayals. In the months and years that followed, law enforcement gained tools. Public awareness of organized crime spiked, and prosecutors finally had a blueprint. The code of silence, once considered unbreakable, began to fray. The idea that a made man could speak without dying on the spot changed the unwritten rules of the underworld. Joseph Valacchi died in prison on April 3, 1971. He built an empire where few believed one could on the gritty streets of Harlem in the 1970s. Born in 1933, Leroy Barnes rose from petty crime and early prison stints to become the head of the Council, a seven-man syndicate that controlled a vast portion of the heroin trade in Harlem and beyond. The Council operated like a tight-knit crime family. Wholesale importation, dilution, and distribution of heroin, layered street-level distribution under lieutenants, strict internal discipline. Barnes forged alliances not just among Harlem crews, but even with parts of the Italian-American mafia, arranging heroin shipments, using front businesses such as car dealerships, and laundering money through a fleet of luxury cars, apartments, and tailored suits. He called himself Mr. Untouchable. The nickname caught public attention. In 1977, the New York Times Magazine put him on its cover, a bold statement, Harlem's biggest drug dealer, flaunting wealth and influence, but that notoriety became a liability. Federal prosecutors, under pressure after that cover story and mounting public outcry, even from the White House, targeted him relentlessly. In January 1978, Barnes was convicted on drug trafficking charges and sentenced to life in prison without parole. While behind bars, Barnes discovered the betrayal that would break him. His former partners had stopped maintaining his defense. Attorneys' fees dried up, and worse, he learned that a fellow council member, Guy Fisher, was entangled with Barnes' mistress. That violated their own code. For Barnes, that treachery cut deeper than prison walls. In 1982, Barnes made his choice. He agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. He sent them a list. More than 100 names, including several council members, associates, even his wife. Names tied to drug trafficking, murders, rackets. On March 15, 1983, he testified against former associates, exposing the council's hierarchy, its operations, the mechanisms of its heroin pipeline, and the internal enforcement methods, including violence against informants and rule breakers. His cooperation cracked the organization open. Dozens of traffickers were indicted, many got convicted. Council enforcers, dealers, managers all fell under the weight of his testimony and evidence law enforcement had gathered. Former allies became witnesses. The heroin empire that once seemed invincible began to collapse. For Harlem and for the underworld, the consequences rippled wide. The council's monopoly dissolved. The old alliances fractured. The idea that even a kingpin's empire was unbreakable died that day. Barnes was eventually released from prison. After years in the Federal Witness Protection Program, he faded into anonymity under a new identity. His decision to betray the code, to name names, testify against those who once called him brother proved a stark lesson. In the world of narcotics and crime, loyalty can be bought and even kings fall. It was a betrayal that belonged in a Greek tragedy. Loyalties dissolving, bullets replaced by secrecy, an entire crime family trembling from the inside. This is the story of Alphonse Darko, the man who led the Lucchese crime family as acting boss, then walked into the offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and never looked back. His defection didn't just rattle one crew, it threatened to pull the foundations from under the mafia in New York. He began as a street-level associate in the 1950s, working under the Capo regime Paul Vario in Brooklyn. After decades of crime, hijackings, loan sharking, narcotics, robbery, and reportedly 10 murders, Darko officially became a made man on August 23, 1982. When the old leadership cracked under federal pressure in the mid-1980s, the Lucchese family turned over control to a new generation, Victor Amuso as boss and Anthony Casso as underboss. Darko rose with them. By 1988, he was capo of Vario's old crew. By 1990, he managed major construction rackets for the family, union payoffs, contracts, the whole syndicate business. Inside, though, the family's heart was rotting. Amuso and Casso ruled with paranoia. Orders flew, beatings, murders, even threats against members' wives and kids, something that violated even the mafia's own old rules. In 1991, after a botched attempt to kill Capo Peter Chiodo, who survived a burst of bullets, Darko realized he'd been marked for death himself. The violence had turned inward, the internal war intensifying. Survivor had become the only rule. On September 18, 1991, at a meeting in a Manhattan hotel, Darko saw the truth. A soldier showed up carrying a gun beneath his shirt. The kind of setup that meant one thing, a hit waiting in the bathroom. Darko bolted. His driver was gone. The next day, the FBI alerted him. Yes, the family had targeted him. That night, he fled to a safe house with his wife and son. Then he asked for protection and offered cooperation. With that decision, Darko became the first acting boss of a major New York crime family to turn informant. His testimony over the next decade helped convict a score of mobsters, including Amuso, prominent capos, and even corrupt law enforcement officers who worked as hitmen. He exposed murder plots, contract hits, internal betrayals, the financial skeleton of rackets, and the breakdown of loyalty that had quietly consumed the family from within. Darko didn't claim he'd turned for a deal. He said he did it because the mafia had lost its shape. The world he once respected, where honor among criminals meant something, had become a brutal scramble for survival. When a job needed to be done, he said, I was the prick chosen by them. After years in witness protection, Darko died quietly in 2019, but his defection left a wound that never healed. The LUCCHESE family sank into chaos, its rackets collapsing, its members exposed, its walls, once built on fear and silence, laid bare. Vincent Chin Gigante rose from the streets of Greenwich Village to the throne of America's most powerful mafia family. Born in 1928, Gigante once boxed professionally, but by the mid-20th century, he had traded the ring for the life of an enforcer. He became a Kappa regime under the old guard, and by 1981, he was recognized as boss of the Genovese family. Behind the scene, though, the family disguised its leadership. For a time, a front boss maintained appearances while Gigante ruled silently. But keeping power meant staying invisible. Gigante cultivated a bizarre, paranoid persona, wandering the streets of Greenwich Village in bathrobe and slippers, mumbling to himself in apparent madness. Newspapers nicknamed him the Odd Father, the enigma in the bathrobe. To the outside world, it looked like a deranged don with nothing to hide but madness. To the underworld, it was cunning camouflage. For decades, no wiretap could catch him. He avoided phones. He forbade name-dropping. Men in the family referred to him by touching their chins or making a C sign. Under that cloak, Gigante pulled the strings. The Genovese family managed bookmaking, loan sharking, extortion, control of unions, rackets tied to construction, trucking, waterfront, all the infrastructure that kept the mafia's power alive in New York. But the mafia's code of silence, omerta, was only as strong as the men who believed in it. Over time, as law enforcement pressure mounted, cracks began to appear. Members and associates within the family saw survival or opportunity or revenge, and they started talking. The turning point came in the 1990s. Former insiders told prosecutors that Gigante's Insanity Act was a fraud. People who had sat with him in meetings, silent men in dark rooms, swore under oath that he was lucid, decisive, commanding. In 1990, Gigante was indicted on federal racketeering charges. The courtroom became the next battleground. His defense painted him as mentally unfit, involuntarily confined to psychiatric hospitals dozens of times over decades, a man too unstable to stand trial. But prosecutors pressed on. Witnesses, former mobsters, insiders, cooperating criminals contradicted the insanity narrative. In March 1996, a judge ruled Gigante competent to stand trial. His trial began in June 1997. By then, enough skeletons had spilled from the closet, from wiretaps, informants, associates flipping. After a short deliberation, the jury convicted Gigante of racketeering and conspiracy, though they acquitted him of murder charges. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison and fined heavily. That conviction was more than just one man's fall. It exposed what mafia life looked like when the walls crumbled from within, not under bullets but under fear, betrayal, and cold legal logic. The myth of the infallible Don, untouchable, unseen, omnipotent, died that day. The code of silence proved fragile. The people inside began choosing protection over loyalty, survival over respect. Gigante spent the rest of his days behind bars. He died in prison in 2005. He was born May 8, 1928 in Brooklyn, New York, a street tough from Bensonhurst who'd grown up in the underworld, broken in by family ties and neighborhood codes. By the 1950s and early 60s, he had emerged within the Colombo family. Scarpa became a capo, a made man entrusted with muscle, intimidation, and enforcement. By many accounts, he earned nicknames like the Grim Reaper, and the Mad Hatter, marks of a man who inspired fear. But beneath that fearsome reputation, another reality took shape. The Bureau opened contact with him on March 20th, 1962, after he was arrested for armed robbery. From that moment, Scarpa became an informant, one of the most dangerous, self-aware, and paradoxical figures the FBI ever handled. In the 1960s, when 3 civil rights workers murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi remained missing, FBI files later showed they secretly used Scarpa's brutality to force answers. According to testimony, he helped extract information from a Klan member and located the victims' bodies, a testament to just how tangled Scarpa's dual loyalties had become. Scarpa's role was not that of a repentant gangster cooperating to atone. He remained deeply embedded in the Colombo family's violent hierarchy. He reportedly continued racketeering, hijackings, extortion, robberies, and by many counts, dozens upon dozens of murders, even while feeding the FBI intelligence. In the 1980s and into the early 1990s, when the Colombo family exploded into internal war, Scarpa played a pivotal role. He backed the faction loyal to the boss Carmine Persico against rebel forces led by Victor Orena. As rival mobsters fell, some by bullets, others by betrayal. Scarpa's intelligence on enemy movements, allegedly passed to him by his FBI handler, Lindley DeVecchio, gave him a lethal advantage. In 1993, Scarpa was finally convicted on 3 murders and sentenced to life in prison. Just a year later, on June 4, 1994, he died in a federal prison in Rochester, Minnesota, reportedly from complications tied to AIDS. But his death didn't close the book. When prosecutorial and civil rights researchers later gained access to FBI files, they revealed just how deep the rot had spread. A federal judge eventually ordered the release of hundreds of pages documenting Scarpa's decades-long role as a top-echelon informant, and how agents may have turned a blind eye to murders committed by him even while using him as a source. For the Mafia families, the betrayal of trust that Scarpa embodied didn't come with fanfare or a courtroom confession. It came quietly, inside shadows. A capo carrying a gun in one pocket, a hidden FBI handler's dossier in another. When he ordered hits, he also carried in his mind the names and secrets of friends and enemies, a ledger of violence and information balanced on a scale that served both the underworld and the law. Scarpa's story forced organized crime to reckon with a bitter truth. Sometimes loyalty means nothing. Silence can be bought, death can mingle with disclosure, and one man walking both sides of the line can leave the world of mafia violence forever changed. The betrayal came in slow motion, but the impact hit like a thunderbolt. In 1991, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, once underboss of Gambino crime family, made an impossible decision. He would turn state's evidence and testify against his boss, John Gotti. Sammy didn't come forward lightly. He had just about everything the mafia valued: power, reputation, a seat at the table. Back in 1985, he'd helped plan and carry out the hit that eliminated the former boss Paul Castellano and lifted Gotti to the throne. Gotti promoted him, first to capo, then consigliere, and by 1988, underboss. But inside the family, things were shifting. Federal surveillance planted bugs, tape recordings from the Ravenite Social Club, the Gambino's nerve center, began revealing conversations about greed, paranoia, shifting loyalties, and internal murder plots. Gotti was heard complaining about crews popping up new companies, about partners not falling in line, about disposing of threats. One wiretap from December 1989 captured him explicitly referencing hits on those he didn't trust. Gravano believed what he heard. To him, it wasn't boss talk, it was a death sentence wrapped in polite lies. By November 13th, 1991, he had walked into a federal prosecutor's office and made the deal. In the spring of 1992, the courtroom at the U.S. District Court in Brooklyn became the stage for one of the most shocking betrayals in mafia history. Gotti's friends, former lieutenants, crew members, everyone wanted to know, could the underboss really testify? The prosecution opened the case with wiretaps, secret recordings, and surveillance evidence showing Gotti and his inner circle discussing murders, extortion, loan sharking, and other rackets. Then came Sammy. On March 2nd, 1992, he took the stand. He didn't plead. He didn't act like a scared rat on trial before rivals. He spoke calmly, methodically. He described exactly how the hit on Castellano and his underboss had been planned and executed. The drive to Sparks Steakhouse, the waiting car, the shooters, the collapse on the curb. He confessed his own role in 19 murders over his criminal career. He named names. He laid out the Gambinos' hierarchy, their code, their secrets, every detail that once lived in whispers. Defense attorneys tried to rattle him during cross-examination. They questioned his past, his motives, his credibility, hoping to turn the jury against his story. But Gravano held firm. The tapes, the timelines, the corroborating evidence made his testimony almost bulletproof. By April 2nd, 1992, after just 14 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Gotti guilty on all counts. Life in prison without parole. The Teflon Don, haunted now by the very underboss he once trusted, was finally locked away. Gravano's reward was shockingly light, a 5-year sentence, credit for time served, and a deal that dropped the 19 murder charges. He and his family entered witness protection, then drifted out. But the blow to organized crime went far beyond Gotti behind bars. His betrayal tore open the code of silence. Associates from multiple families began cooperating. Prosecutions gained strength. The fear that once held the mafia together started to crumble. For the first time, the streets realized, in that world, loyalty could die as quietly as a tape recorder clicking on, and betrayal might be the only way out. It began quietly in the mid-1970s, not with a scream or a gunshot, but with a name whispered in a dim bar. Over drinks and crooked laughs, the name was Joseph D. Pistone, but within the underworld he called himself Donnie Brasco. The men of the Bonanno crime family thought they had found another small-time jewel thief hungry for opportunity. What they didn't know was, Brasco was an undercover agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and over 5 years, he would walk into the belly of the beast. Pistone entered undercover in 1976. Initially, he worked among hijackers and small-time thieves tied to the Colombo family, but by the end of the year, he had shifted under the wing of a Bonanno capo, thanks to introductions by mobster Anthony Mirror. When Mirror went to prison, Pistone didn't disappear, he got taken under by soldier Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero. Lefty, a hardened street man, was impressed when Brasco showed knowledge of jewels and an attitude that passed the simplest of loyalty tests. Over nightly drinks, Pistone built trust. Every joke, every handshake, every careful nod, they wrote the lines of a performance designed to get closer to the heart of the crime family. As time passed, Pistone heard secrets. He heard about deals, he heard names, rackets and gambling, hijacking, extortion, maybe even narcotics. The Bonannos didn't treat him like a mark, they treated him like family. He grew closer to men like Ruggiero, even to higher-ups. The family believed their trust was earned. By the time the late 1970s came around, their faith in him had become fatal. In 1981, after roughly 5 years undercover, the FBI pulled the plug. With the evidence Pistone gathered, recordings, testimonies, knowledge of operations, prosecutors moved in. Over 100 mobsters linked to the Bonanno family were indicted. Convictions followed. The breach was too deep, the mistake too serious. The family, once one of the proudest of the New York 5 families, was expelled from the ruling council, the Commission. But the betrayals didn't end with Pistone's unmasking. Decades later, in the early 2000s, the rot went deeper. Joseph Charles Massino, who rose to boss of the Bonanno family in the 1990s, presided over a fragile recovery. The Donnie Brasco scandal had humiliated the family. They had lost power, influence, standing. Massino tried to rebuild. Then came 2002. Frank Copper Sr., once a made man inside the Bonannos, known for fraud, stock scams, and old-style racketeering, became the first made man from the Bonanno family to turn informant. His cooperation gave prosecutors access to detailed records: who did what, how orders passed, who ordered hits, who spent whose money. What followed was a cascade. On January 9, 2003, Massino was arrested in a sweeping racketeering indictment alongside underboss Salvatore "Good-Looking Sal" Vitale, several capos, and associates. The FBI revealed that they'd even uncovered a contract Massino had ordered on Vitale, suspecting he was about to flip. Vitale did flip. He admitted to more than a dozen murders and dozens of criminal acts. His testimony exposed the Bonannos' internal crimes stretching decades. When the trial concluded, Massino was convicted on 11 RICO counts. Facing a death penalty trial over several murders, he chose to cooperate instead, becoming the first Don of one of the 5 families to turn state's witness. With the betrayals piling up, first Pistone's undercover infiltration, then Copper's turn, then Vitale, then Massino himself, the Bonanno family collapsed under its own weight. The structure, the discipline, the code that was meant to bind them began to resemble an old canvas soaked through with water. It sagged, it cracked, and it tore. The family lost its grip on power in New York. Its seat on the Mafia Commission was lost. Its reputation was ruined. The story of the Bonannos became a warning. Betrayal doesn't always storm in with guns. Often it comes with quiet voices, hidden microphones, alliances broken behind closed doors. And when the silence of Omerta broke from within, the fall was swift. It started on a cold December evening in Manhattan, the kind where the streetlights shine off wet pavement and the city feels like it's holding its breath. Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino crime family, rode towards Sparks' Steakhouse on East 46th Street. He was 64 years old, carrying the weight of a quiet, corporate-style reign that never sat right with the men who lived closer to the street. At his side was his newly appointed underboss, Tommy Bellotti, a loyal enforcer who handled Castellano's business with a blunt, sometimes reckless hand. Across the river, tension had been building for months. John Gotti, a capo out of Ozone Park, had grown tired of Castellano's rules, tired of the distance the boss kept from the street crews, and tired of the pressure he faced after the murder of drug dealer James McBratney and the later fallout from the Castellano edict against narcotics. Gotti wasn't alone. His closest circle, men like Angelo Ruggiero and Sammy Gravano, felt exposed. Wiretaps had caught Ruggiero talking about heroin. Rumors reached Castellano. He wanted tapes, explanations, discipline. For Gotti's crew, it felt like a countdown. The moment Castellano named Bellotti as his new underboss, something inside the Gambino family shifted. Veterans who had spent years waiting for that promotion watched a driver leapfrog the hierarchy. Gotti read the mood. The boss looked isolated, distracted, out of touch with the men whose muscle kept the rackets alive. In that climate, Gotti made a decision that defied every code the Mafia claimed to live by. He wouldn't ask permission. He wouldn't wait for a ruling from the commission. He would take the family by force. On December 16, 1985, Castellano's Lincoln pulled up outside Sparks around 5:30 in the evening. Holiday shoppers filled the sidewalks, traffic crawled. The hit team moved in with long trench coats and winter hats that made them blend into the midtown crowd. Castellano stepped out first. Bellotti followed. Before either man could react, the shooters closed in. Gunfire cracked across the street. Castellano collapsed near the curb. Bilotti fell a few steps away, his last moments spent trying to understand where the ambush had come from. They never saw the men who killed them. They never saw the car idling at a distance where John Gotti watched the entire hit unfold from behind tinted glass. Sammy Gravano sat beside him, listening as one of the lookouts used a walkie-talkie to confirm the job was finished. In the chaos that followed, Gotti's car eased into traffic and disappeared. News of the murder spread in minutes. By nightfall, every crew in the city knew what had happened. The commission hadn't approved it. Castellano hadn't expected it. The old rules, the ones that supposedly governed power, respect, and succession, evaporated on the sidewalk outside a steakhouse. Within days, Gotti stepped into the role of boss. He wore tailored suits, smiled for cameras, and walked the streets like a man who owned the spotlight. Reporter gave him names that sounded like headlines: the Dapper Don, later the Teflon Don. But the glare that made him a celebrity also made him a target. Prosecutors listened to every brag, every whisper. The FBI built thicker case files. The Justice Department started to believe that if they could crack the Gambinos, they could crack the entire mafia structure. The hit on Paul Castellano didn't just change the Gambinos, it changed the temperature of organized crime in America. It showed the world that ambition inside the mafia didn't always wait for approval. It showed law enforcement that the families weren't united under old world ceremony. And it showed everyone watching that when a boss falls in the street, the fallout reaches every corner of the underworld. Tommaso Buscetta spent most of his life walking a thin line between loyalty and survival. He was born in Palermo in 1928, the youngest of 17 children, and by the time he reached adulthood, he had already stepped into the world of the Sicilian mafia, the Cosa Nostra, long before the term hit newspapers. To the men around him, Buscetta wasn't just another soldier. He was a man who understood the old ways, the codes, the quiet rules that kept Sicily's criminal network humming beneath politics, religion, and daily life. By the early 1980s, that world was turning into something unrecognizable. The mafia in Sicily had entered a violent civil war. On one side stood the Corleonesi, led by Salvatore Riina, men who rose through brutality, not tradition. On the other side were older families who believed in measured violence and long memories. Buscetta's relatives, his friends, even two of his sons were caught in the crossfire. One by one, they vanished or turned up dead. Every message he received from Sicily carried the same grim truth. Riina didn't want peace. He wanted extermination. Buscetta fled the island. For a while, he drifted between Brazil and the United States, trying to outrun a war that felt personal. In 1983, Brazilian authorities arrested him at the request of Italy. They wanted him back not because they believed he would talk, but because he was one of the last men alive who truly understood how Cosa Nostra operated. The Brazilian police tortured him during extradition. Riina's men tortured his family back home. At some point, the silence that had guided his life cracked. In 1984, Buscetta asked to speak to one man, an investigative magistrate from Palermo named Giovanni Falcone. Falcone wasn't a cop in a trench coat or a grandstanding politician. He was a quiet, relentless judge who treated organized crime like a patient and dangerous equation. He listened more than he spoke. And that was exactly what Buscetta needed. Their conversations filled weeks. Buscetta spoke in low, steady tones, explaining the mafia not as a series of crimes, but as a system. He described how families were structured, how bosses communicated, how orders traveled from Palermo to New York without a single phone call. He explained why killings happened, not simply who pulled the trigger. For the first time in modern Italian history, a made man broke the code of silence for reasons deeper than self-preservation. He wasn't trading information for freedom. He was mourning sons, friends, a world he believed had been poisoned beyond recognition. Falcone used Buscetta's testimony as the foundation for something Italy had never attempted on such a scale: a single trial large enough to capture the architecture of Cosa Nostra. They built a courtroom inside a reinforced concrete bunker in Palermo. It looked less like a place for justice and more like a fortress preparing for siege. Inside it stood hundreds of cages for defendants. In February 1986, the Maxi trial began. 475 people were indicted: bosses, capos, soldiers, political intermediaries, an entire ecosystem dragged into the open. Buscetta testified calmly, answering each question with precision. He identified bosses, he explained alliances, he named the commission, the governing council most Italians believed existed only in rumor. He described the chain of command behind murders that had haunted Sicily for generations. Falcone's questions were sharp but never theatrical. Buscetta's answers changed how Italy understood the mafia. Until then, prosecutors had treated killings and extortion as isolated crimes. Buscetta showed them the threads that connected everything. It wasn't chaos, it was strategy. When the verdicts arrived in December 1987, the numbers stunned the country. Hundreds of convictions. The bosses who survived the mafia war suddenly found themselves behind bars. For a brief moment, it felt as if the state had finally caught up to Cosa Nostra. But the mafia remembers its wounds. In 1992, Giovanni Falcone was murdered on the highway near Capaci. A bomb buried beneath the road blew apart his car, his escorts, and the ground they traveled on. It was retaliation for the Maxi trial, a message from Rina's faction that no one, not even a judge, could change the balance of power without paying a price. Buscetta lived long enough to testify again, this time in the United States against the so-called Pizza Connection network and other transnational operations linking Sicily to American families. Age softened him, but it didn't quiet his conviction that Cosa Nostra had abandoned any sense of honor it once claimed to possess. He died in 2000 under witness protection in the United States, far from Sicily, far from the graveyards filled during the years he tried to outrun. What he left behind wasn't just testimony, it was a blueprint, a confession from a man who helped build the very thing he later dismantled. His cooperation with Falcone didn't just shake the mafia, it shook the myth. It showed that the strongest families in the world could be undone by a truth spoken softly, by a man who had finally seen enough blood to know where the path ended.